Hello there and welcome to the Bitcoin Takeover podcast. I'm here in the state of Colorado attending ETH Denver. Actually not quite because I'm still in the hotel lobby. This is season 17 episode 9 and I am next to Cameron Robertson, who is the co-founder of Burner, and also he has been doing a lot of stuff in Bitcoin since he discovered it in 2010. And he's built a bunch of companies, tried to make it work as a bearer asset for a long time. Now he specializes in making it easy for you to self-custody and spend with the Burner card, and he also made a terminal that lets you pay, I guess, via Flexa in the United States to a lot of merchants. It's pretty cool, and I gotta thank Tyler Spalding for doing the introductions for this one. And I think there are going to be like two main topics that we're going to discuss. Bitcoin in 2010 and what you think about Bitcoin today. And the second big one is, of course, the Burner card, which is slick, works with an NFC chip, is interesting, but I do have some questions as in what's going to happen if your website goes down and stuff like this. Like, is it really good for long-term cold storage? So it's really good to have you, Cameron. I talk a lot. Let's have you talking about any of these topics. It's your choice where you're going to start.
Yeah, I'd be happy to start at the beginning with Bitcoin back in the day. So I think I actually learned about Bitcoin, it was summer of 2009 from a Slashdot post. And it was the Bitcoin paper. And I had been studying economics and I saw the paper and my immediate reaction was, there's no way they're going to let this happen, as in governments or other institutions, especially the way, obviously everyone who's read the paper, the way it read was very bold, talking about effectively non-sovereign money. And I thought, well, this is a crazy idea, super interesting. I decided to download the Bitcoin client then, and I think I had a MacBook at the time, and I'm like, well, this isn't gonna work. I don't have my PC set up. Then we decided to set up a PC, we as in the company, the startup we were running at the time, and we couldn't get it working, and basically we were super busy building our company. We were in Y Combinator at the time, and we said, okay, well, this is cool, we'll forget about it for a little bit. So set that aside. Of course, from 2009 to 2011, things changed a lot. And I know a lot of folks who weren't around in the space now, you'd think like, well, those are still both OG days. But the big difference is in 2009, you had to solo mine. There were no markets. Nobody knew what it was worth. By 2011, you started to have pools and stuff. And there started to be marketplaces where you could more easily sell Bitcoin. Still wasn't really worth very much. But that's when I really started to decide to do some GPU mining. So in 2011, I took an old PC, I put in some GPUs, I got it all working and mining, and I'm trying to remember what the pool was at the time. I think it was Slush Pool or something like that. And
it was bitcoinmining.cz.
Yeah, right. It was way back. And I'm like, I hope that they give me my Bitcoin when I mine it, but whatever. Like, otherwise, I'm not going to mine solo blocks on a GPU. By 2011, the difficulty had increased so much. And so I left it running, forgot about it for a week or two, and then I think my roommates started to complain about it because it was kind of noisy, and they're like, how much energy is this costing us? And I'm like, okay, I looked at it, some small fragments of Bitcoin, so I turned it off because I'm like, I don't want to deal with fighting with my roommates over this. So very early, thought it was super interesting, and then basically kind of dipped out of the space for a while. I remember when Coinbase launched, because we had been in Y Combinator, and at the time we were doing a door lock company. We were the first company to make smartphone controlled door locks so you can unlock the door with your phone. And through a weird series of connections, we knew the Airbnb guys and were able to work out of the Airbnb office 2012, 2013. And at the same time, there's this Airbnb employee, and he's like, oh, I love that you guys are working on hardware stuff. I'm gonna be building this new company, which turned into Coinbase. It was Brian Armstrong. And so I watched that, and I think I spoke to Brian back then. He at the YC demo day, he was giving out a free Bitcoin to everybody for signing up. At the time, again, it was worth $15, so worth way more than a few pennies or cents in the super OG days, but not super interesting. It was like, okay, cool, thanks, $15 for free is awesome. And continue building Lockatron. throughout the Lockatron days, we started to see more stuff emerging in the space, other chains, the Ethereum ICO, and then the DAO, and then the hack. But what's really interesting is around the time of the DAO, we had people reaching out to us about our door locks. They said, hey, your door locks have amazingly open APIs, and we're building this crazy crypto paid Airbnb on Ethereum. And in 2016, this just sounded completely insane 10 years ago. We're like, what are you guys talking about? Yeah, completely insane. Right. And we said, okay, sure, we'll sell you door locks. But it kind of pulled us into like, well, interesting stuff is happening. We should check back in. And so by the time we sold that company, late 2017, early 2018, we were really just pilled on the idea of building really easy to use self-custody tools with the ultimate vision that everybody should be fully empowered to hold their own crypto, but it needed to be really simple. And I think at that point in time, folks like Ledger and Trezor had already done a lot of hard work, but we wanted to re-envision it. And so what you see today with Burner is a far cry from what we started with. The first thing that we built, well, taking a step back. So from the door lock days, we built a lot of stuff with secure chips. And so we had a lot of experience with these secure chips. And we said, well, can we simplify the whole scope of a hardware wallet so that you don't have all these complex other components? Because obviously with ledgers and Trezors, one of the biggest challenges are supply chain attacks involving firmware, or doing some crazy low-level attacks between the two chips on the wallets and then interposing and doing a malicious firmware update. So we said, okay, if we can rely entirely on a secure element, obviously there's a lot of trust on the secure element and the manufacturer, but if you can scope things down to just that secure element and you presume that you'll never do firmware updates, you actually limit a whole set of attacks. So we said, okay, let's do that, but then let's make it in a form factor that people really understand. And so we built this completely fabricated, fanciful project called Concash. And that's actually where I met Tyler. They were these beautiful, flexible circuit boards, but they were the size and shape of cash. And we made several denominations. And on them, they actually had the secure element and an NFC chip mounted on there so that you could hold it to your phone and see if the value was still locked. Now, this was this random Kong ERC20 token we did. We never had any desire to make it valuable. It wasn't meant to be a scam or anything. We're just like, hey, we need to put a token on this and hand it out to people and see if they're interested in this as a form factor. Because the idea was, well, if we could scale it, then we could do any cryptocurrency on it, Bitcoin, something that people thought was valuable, and lock it up for a long time. And so we had this time lock element where you could claim the funds off of the Concash after 3 years, and it was locked in a smart contract. But before that time, you could only treat it as a cash note. You could only go spend it like cash, and it could only be circulated, in cash registers and ATMs and things like that. And so it was a really cool project. It worked. It was very conceptual. The notes were a little bit fragile because if you bend them really hard, they would break apart and the NFC scanning would break. But conceptually, it was really powerful because you could now give crypto to a person who literally knew absolutely nothing about it. I mean, people from age 3 to 100 know what cash is. They know how to count it. They know how to spend it. It's incredibly easy to use. And so that was the mental model. And the reactions that people had to it were like, they were completely bifurcated. Either they really loved it and they're like, of course, like cash has been around for a long time. This is the bridge that we need to get for everyday people to start using Bitcoin. Or they absolutely despised it. I mean, a lot of people were like, the point of Bitcoin is digital money. Why are you doing this? Peer-to-peer transactions electronically, not physically. And we're like, you're getting too wrapped up in it. Ultimately, everyone will be using digital currencies electronically, but you need a tool to get over the hump that's familiar for people. So we built that project. We made, a few thousand of those notes, sold some, but more as collector's items. The token was never a big part of it. And we got some feedback from people. And at that time, the NFT market started to take off, say like 2020, 21. And people said, hey, can we have the chip portion of this and can we put it into physical things? Because we want to identify it on the blockchain. And so we took the chip portion of that and we made these chips called halos, and they look like an NFC tag, but the difference between those and an NFC tag is they actually have a full asymmetric public-private key pair, just like a Bitcoin key. And so you could sign transactions on any chain that takes K1 signatures, so Bitcoin, Ethereum, etc. But more importantly, you could authenticate and you say, okay, only this one-of-one garment is the only one with this chip with this public key, and you could challenge it. You could say, hey, I'm going to send you a random number, garment, give me back a signature to prove you're authentic. Super interesting concept. A lot of early NFT projects used it in different things, but what we saw was when the NFT market started to dip down, real world brands weren't going to jump onto this. Crypto had sort of tainted it. The NFT market crashing had tainted it. And so we saw, I still believe that the future of high-end physical goods will all have some identifying chip like this. But the reality of it is going to take much longer, and it doesn't necessarily need to be anchored on a blockchain. I think that's a powerful feature, the immutability of it, the fact that you can record it for a long time, but I think that's still coming. So in the meantime, we decided to go back to our roots. We launched Offline Cash, which is a Bitcoin version of the Kong note, and we took a lot of learnings from the Kong note. It's actually printed on a synthetic paper. It's ultra resilient. We went to secure printers, and it has all these incredible elements like microtext, this intaglio process where you can actually feel the print on it. It's a beautiful artifact. And we did 4 notes in various amounts of millibitcoin, which is kind of a weird unit. And the reason why we did
it's in the Electrum wallet.
It's an OG unit. A lot of people at that time were getting really all about, like, it's got to be sats. And so the big problem we came to was this. The reason why we chose millibitcoin is because when you look at a face value note from a country, a fractional number makes no sense. Putting 0.00001 BTC on something is just confusing and people don't get it. And sats, over time, as Bitcoin gets more valuable, will make more sense. But at the time when we launched this, or we were planning it, and Bitcoin was 20K or something like that, we said, gosh, it's just, these are going to look like really big numbers. And the concern there was then it starts to look like Zimbabwe dollars, and it actually devalues the psychological value of Bitcoin, of being like, oh, this has got, hundreds of thousands of sats on it. Like, what does that even mean? So at the time we chose millibitcoin because we could have a really nice clean, 1, 2, 5, and 10 denominations. It felt like cash. Pretty valuable amounts of cash, but I think it ranged from, trying to think of the numbers. When we were planning basically to have a $20, 40, 100, and then 200. And of course now Bitcoin got more valuable, and so that went up. But conceptually it was the same thing. It had a secure NFC chip, and you could associate funds on the chip. That chip wasn't as sophisticated. It didn't have a public-private key pair. It was still fully non-custodial, but there were some assumptions we didn't like about it, but it made the whole note flexible and more resilient. You can always claim the funds off of it without us, but in order to lock the funds on it, we have to have the server mechanism. If the server ever goes away, you can still claim the funds, but you'll just be delayed claiming them from the Bitcoin script until 2029. So it might be a forced lock that you don't want to have. But it also had this other really cool element where if you want to claim the funds immediately, you could use scissors and you could cut through the note and it tampered a trace. And so that's in the flexible offline cash note. So we built that. We launched that, I think, summer of 2022. Again, I think that's become more of like a collector's item than a real production item. It was basically our last attempt at saying, okay, let's try a cash instrument. And what the conclusion we came to is it's a really cool collector's item, but the problem with distributing cash is central banks do it because they need their economies to function. But when you're saying, hey, I'm going to have you pay $50 for this set of notes that you're going to go load and then hand out, like that's a pretty steep ask for individuals. And so like in theory, you could bring the cost down, but realistically issuing cash is something that governments do, and Bitcoin being explicitly a non-governmental money, it's very hard to do. I think we can talk later about some like very future versions of where that would come in maybe again, but didn't make sense. So after that, we said, okay, we've done a lot of the secure chip technology. We've really like thought through this. Like, what's another form factor that we can focus on where we can make it really easy to use, very secure, but maybe we'll move away from the cash. And so that's when we started planning Burner. And so Burner, as you can see, it looks like a standard credit card, key card, NFC, comes in a fun color. There have been other card wallets for a long time, Tangem and Arculus and a handful of others. But we said we want to keep it really, really simple. So one of the biggest differences between a Burner and some of these other wallets is we're very focused on the currencies. So the Bitcoin version is just Bitcoin. We have an ETH version that's just ETH. Like, we want clarity for the holder of it. And it's fully web-based. So when you tap it to your phone, you don't have to install an app. You can immediately start sending and withdrawing funds from it just from your web browser on iOS and Android. And the other reason we like that is because we had multiple apps that were kicked out of either the Play Store or the App Store at various times, and their policies didn't like crypto. And we said, this is ridiculous. Like, we hate that Google and Apple will just kick you out of the App Store. And so by going to the browser, they have much less control. It's like, you can block our website, but I don't think they've ever really done that before. So yeah, and then the goal of Burner at launch was purely focused on gifting and saving. So you can put small amounts of Bitcoin on it to save for yourself, or you can put small amounts of Bitcoin on to easily gift to somebody. And I don't think it's quite as perfectly easy to use as we want, but versus other ways of gifting Bitcoin, of just handing them a private key and a QR code, or a ledger or something like that, it's far simpler. And we heard a lot of stories from people who gifted crypto back in those OG days of like 2012, 2013, and they printed QR codes, and the person either lost them, threw them away, or the saddest ones where it was printed on receipt paper and it just faded away. And so we wanted something that looks cool, so you know probably not to throw it out, and it will have some residual value to it.
Yeah, while I check the camera, because this is happening, yeah, it's all good. I just want to say that I've done some research. It's purely coincidental, because for a long time I was fascinated with the idea of Bitcoin banknotes.
Yeah.
There are two reasons for it, because Bitcoin, we didn't do a good job scaling it. So if you had banknotes to actually make payments in person, you basically get rid of a bunch of on-chain transactions. But there are also some privacy benefits to it. Like, nobody knows that this amount no longer, this UTXO no longer belongs to this person. It can change like 1,000 hands in between actual on-chain transactions. And I think that's pretty cool. The concept, I think, goes back to Gavin Andreessen, 2010. Someone asked him if you can have Bitcoin Cash, not Bitcoin Cash BCH, but cash that actually passes on the ownership of Bitcoin. At the time, the idea was that you can print paper wallets, which is something that people have been using for a long time, either with QR codes that you scan, which represent private keys, or with BIP39 or BIP38 before that. We had the Casascius coins. That's also an interesting experiment, the Casascius coins, which Mike Caldwell has been making using his own standard, and I think he had to stop because of some US laws or regulations. And those are super collectible. I think right now if you can buy a 1 Bitcoin Casascius coin with 1.2 Bitcoin or something like this. So there's a premium to that one, even though you still have to trust Mike Caldwell to not have stored any of the private keys after he minted the coins. And I also know that Sergio Damien Lerner came up with a concept that's called Bit Banknotes, which is very similar to what you're describing. So historically speaking, there's a long tradition with this. Maybe it sounds counterintuitive because Bitcoin was designed to replace paper money. But there are some benefits to it, especially since we haven't really scaled Bitcoin to the point where we can have millions of transactions every day and use it for everyday commerce. And also, there are not too many privacy protocols that truly preserve your privacy.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the Mike Caldwell, sort of the Casascius coin history, because when we did our Concash notes, and we started looking at legal precedent, that was one of the first things that we looked at to understand why the feds went after him. And there's sort of a couple different reasons. The first one was there was, in theory, potentially money transmission if he was, and again, to be fair, back in the day, people were selling Bitcoin for cash all the time. Like it wasn't, Bitcoin wasn't treated as a money, it was a digital good. And so, so there was some questions around that, but then there was also this question around coinage. So at least in the United States, there's a big distinction between paper money and coinage money in the laws, from the perspective that if you're coining coins, that's actually much riskier and much worse if it's treated as money. There are collectible coins and medallions and other ways to get around that. But the more that crypto started to look more like money by 2019, there's lots of legal precedent. There are more concerns around that. However, paper money, you have much, I don't want to say looser laws, but it's nowhere near as clear to the letter of the law as coinage is. So you really don't want to make your own coins. And then, yeah, I remember with Sergio, he reached out to us as well right after we launched, I believe it was Kong Cash, telling us about, his history working on that stuff. And I think the challenge has always been, you're left with the state of the art of where the chips are and where the hardware is. And it's only continued to get easier to do things, A, with the Bitcoin curve, SecP256K1, and B, the chips have just gotten better and the phones have gotten better. So when we first released Concash in 2019, iOS had just released the NFC APIs for anyone to use. They had kept it locked down to Apple Pay and themselves, and then they finally released the NFC APIs where you could interface through a custom app. And so it's been a long progression of where everything has sort of had to catch up in order to really enable a lot of these different pieces. But yeah, I think that the history of Bitcoin money there goes back pretty far, and a lot of people have been thinking about it. And now the point is, it's possible to offer something like a burner wallet for, we retail them for $9 on Amazon, and so maybe you won't just put $20 of Bitcoin on it, but it's not crazy to think about putting $100 of Bitcoin on it for gifting or something like that.
Yeah, and as you said, it's something that people will think looks cool, so it's very unlikely that they will put this in the garbage bin.
Hopefully.
Hopefully, yeah. I also want to ask you, what was your understanding of Bitcoin when you were mining? Like, did you consider spending it on something, or were you thinking, well, I'll just hold it just in case it catches on? And I'm not asking what happened to those coins, it's your personal business. It's more about your perception of Bitcoin, if it was something that was going to be adopted for payments, or something, as we call it today, a store of value.
So my original interest in Bitcoin was purely, I'm a hacker, I like to build things, and experimental. I throughout high school used to do SETI at home. So SETI at home was this interesting, one of the first big distributed computing projects where you could contribute your CPU power, and SETI was, the search for extraterrestrial life. So you could contribute your CPU power to analyzing this data coming from these radio telescopes to see if you'd find a repeating pattern that looked like it indicated intelligent life. So there were two projects. SETI at home, I think, was the earliest, and then there was one that was folding at home where you could help do DNA analysis and folding to see how RNA produces proteins in different structures. So long story short, there are these two distributed projects that were around pre-Bitcoin. And so when Bitcoin came out and it's like, hey, contribute CPU power to the network and you get this reward, it was like, oh, cool, I just want to contribute the CPU power. If it's worth something, awesome. But you know, I would have been far better off. I think I bought 2 GPUs at the time and I spent $500. I would have been far better off if I found some marketplace to buy $500 of Bitcoin, because I don't remember the pricing in 2011, but I'm sure I would have ended up with a lot more Bitcoin. So my earliest take then was, this is a cool thing to do. I like hacking on projects, and I think that carrying that forward as a theme is worthwhile, of just exploring new stuff. I mean, obviously today the hype is all around AI and AI stuff, but that was my thought early on. Now, fast forward to, let's see, 2013. I'm trying to remember when there was that first run up and Bitcoin, the first time it hit $1,000.
2013.
Yeah, and I was broke. I was paying myself no money from the startup, had no money, and I, had a couple of Bitcoin, small amount of Bitcoin that I'd mined or whatever, and my car broke down, and it was just completely dead. And I'm like, okay, gosh, I have no money. I was looking at like how I could buy a car on a credit card, like a really used old car. And then I saw on Craigslist, there was this guy who was selling this old broken down, what was it? It was an old Porsche, not worth much money. But I'm like, this is cool. I've always wanted a car like that. And he was willing to accept Bitcoin. It was like 1 or 2 Bitcoin. And I was very tempted. And I'm like, wow, this random thing that I mined because I was curious suddenly has value. Maybe I should go buy this car. And luckily it was a series of things where I'm like, well, if this old car breaks down, I'm gonna be back in the same position. And like, I didn't want to drive halfway across the bay. I was living in the Bay Area at the time to get this car or have someone drive me to it. So I forgot about it, which was a good thing. And I think in sort of the history of Bitcoiners, there's a lot of Bitcoiners where kind of forgetting about it, especially from that 2013 period where then things crashed. Then all of a sudden it's like, well, great, now it's not worth anything. Versus being all about trading all the time and getting into risky positions with leverage and stuff. For someone like myself who's not an adept trader, that was a very lucky spot to be in. Likewise, at the time in Silicon Valley, I had a bunch of friends who were into Bitcoin. Tons and tons of people were into Bitcoin, and one of my friends' startups, they were pivoting through a bunch of different ideas, and they set up a massive GPU mine in their house. I mean, it was crazy. They just had motherboards out and CPUs in those motherboards, and they densely packed them in their garage. And it was one of the craziest stories. It was so bad that one day they got a knock on the door from one of the telcos. I think it was like a Verizon, and they basically said like, hey, we tracked down a bunch of interference to your house. Like, what's going on? And they're like, do you guys have a warrant? Like, what do you mean what's going on? And they said, well, we don't have a warrant, but if we bring in like the FCC to come scan your house, like things get really, really bad because the fines are massive. And they're like, okay, I guess we'll show you to our garage. And the guy scans around and he's like, yeah, the interference is from all these crazy open computers and motherboards. And it must have been that the GPU clocks were operating at a certain wavelength that was interfering with the cell network. So they're like, you need to fix this in like 30 days or we're gonna bring the FCC and the fines will be massive. And they figured out that they could wrap everything in chicken wire, that the chicken wire attenuated the signal just perfectly enough that it brought them below the threshold, and they were good. So 30 days later, the guys come, they check, and it's like, great, you're set. But the moral of the story is, so they did all this, but they basically were mining Bitcoin, liquidating it to pay for the energy costs and the hardware costs, made a little bit of money themselves, but then they never held on to BTC. We paid for contractors back in 2015, tons of BTC. They were in Brazil. It was easier to send money. It was like one of the greatest purposes of Bitcoin. But then they had to liquidate it in their local currency because they had to go pay for rent and stuff. So in the early days of BTC, a lot of people used it as money. I mean, we used it as the way it was intended. It was not, the store value narrative didn't become a thing until 2017, I think. So yeah, it was a very different world. And I think my brain shifted too around 2017 and like, oh, okay, I guess Bitcoin going to crazy numbers like 17K and stuff, I guess I should think about it a little bit differently. And I think that's where watching the space since then, the whole move towards thinking about sats instead of Bitcoin is critical. And then obviously L2s and stuff like Lightning and moving away from being really hampered by the 12-minute block time to making spendable Bitcoin has been really helpful. But yeah, we used to spend Bitcoin. I mean, back in Palo Alto would have been in that same time frame, 2012, 2013, there was a coffee shop where you could pay for Bitcoin like do a Bitcoin transaction and I guess like stand around for 12 minutes. And they had some tricks. I guess they would look it up and confirm and be like, we're pretty sure that you've spent the Bitcoin, so we'll give you the coffee. You don't have to wait that long. But yeah, they had all their prices in BTC and you could buy your coffee. And yeah, there are a lot of the same experiments that we have today, 10, 15 years later, being repeated because so much has changed. The tools are so much better, and you can actually start to use it more like money. But I know that there's two divides now, I think, between people and how they think about Bitcoin and whether it's money and whether it's a store of value. And so ultimately, I'd say I personally land on the store of value side for the immediate future. I think that people are not yet thinking about things in terms of Bitcoin prices. Like when we did the Cash project, we looked at the psychology of money, and there's a lot of great papers about it, pre-crypto, just people talking about how one thinks about money. And it's really critical to be able to think, okay, a loaf of bread is $3 this week, and it's going to be $3 next week, and probably $3 a year from now. Obviously, we've gone through inflation recently or whatever, but that's the challenge with BTC, is like to think that it's going to be however many thousand sats today and potentially a few hundred sats in 6 months. It's like, well, did the bread get cheaper or did it get more expensive? It's very difficult, I think. And you know, I'm not writing off the distant or potentially near future where the dollar or euro or yuan doesn't make sense for that mental model anymore because of potential hyperinflation. I can imagine where sats come into that role, but I just don't believe that's the case today and probably for the next 18 months at least.
Yeah, that's actually a very good argument that Bitcoin is not a unit of account. If it was a unit of account, it would be much easier to spend. But since we are denominating in US dollars or euro or whatever fiat currency is dominant in our area, it's not really used as money, at least not yet. But I bought a bunch of stuff with Bitcoin, including my recording gears. Like all of this was bought with Bitcoin, including the phone that's recording.
Yeah.
And my home studio was entirely made with stuff I bought with Bitcoin on various websites. And I did it on purpose. I have zero regrets. I bought this when Bitcoin was like $20,000 or something.
Yeah.
Zero regrets about it. I'm happy that I was able to turn something digital and purely like numbers on the screen into something that actually helps me and improves, actually build something and create something that other people enjoy. So I'm grateful for it.
Yeah.
I'm gonna plug a couple of ads and then I'm gonna ask you more questions about it.
Yeah.
You mentioned Brains. Well, actually, you mentioned Slushpool, and now it's called Brains. And what they did recently was launch a service that's called Hash Power, where you can rent hash rate. Some people refer to that as cloud mining, but I think it's a bit more than that because you don't just set up an account and pay with your credit card or whatever. It's a lot more private. You just set up an account. You can even connect with your Telegram, which doesn't have to be tied to your identity. And then you pay with your Bitcoin, and you can rent as much hash rate as you want. It's a big marketplace where you can find lots of deals. And maybe that you want a 51% attack Bitcoin Cash, or maybe that you want to try a lottery ticket. You can even rationalize how much it costs you to buy one of these tiny ASICs, which sometimes are like $300. And then it's gonna cost you like $20 per month to run it. And instead of doing that, you can actually do like $30 per month as a lottery ticket to buy some hash rate and see if you're gonna hit a block to get the big reward, which is very unlikely, but it's possible. So check it out. The URL is hashrate.brains with a double I.com. And the other sponsor that I want to plug right now is noonce.com, which is a peer-to-peer marketplace made by the guy who previously was known for Paxful. Paxful had gold, had a bunch of very interesting derivative products, but it was based in the US, and that's ultimately what led to its downfall. So Ray Youssef, the creator, decided that he wants to start a new company, a new project, which focuses on onboarding people from the global south, and that's like the target audience that he has right now. people from Africa, the Middle East, and South America, they're big users on Noons, Noons.com. And if you decide to trade there, it's not just for making money, it's also for putting coins into the hands of these people who actually need them for beating inflation or purposes like that. So check it out, it's Noons.com. I always do my ads like this in front of the guest because it's fun to capture some reactions.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you more about the spirit of the old days, because I understand that you got involved mining and you kept an eye, like you met Brian Armstrong in 2012 or something before he started Coinbase. And I'm curious, what was it like when it comes to development? Because today it's a very delicate topic. It seems like we're not making much progress. Back in the day, it was a smaller developer community. It was an open source project that was trying to emulate the culture of Linux. And if you have any stories or any memories with developers and what you are hoping that Bitcoin is gonna become, like in 17 years, that's how long it's been since it came out. So to simplify, because it was a very long question, the difference between your expectations in 2010 and the reality today.
So, yeah, I mean, I was based in Silicon Valley back then, and what I think is interesting is today Bitcoin and the broader crypto ecosystem, they're arguably very distributed. They really are global phenomena. But back then, because it was such a cool technology, a lot of technologies were pretty emergent from Silicon Valley. So there was a really strong cohort of Bitcoiners. The term Bitcoiner wasn't even a thing. There weren't Bitcoiners and no coiners. It was like, oh, Bitcoin is a cool technology and I want to try it because it seems like it might be the future of money. And so things were way less polarized because there wasn't really much to be polarized about at that time. I think I didn't really pay attention to any of the non-Bitcoin crypto projects emerging at that time, but obviously by 2014 you started to see other people from that Silicon Valley milieu or environment bring up projects like Ripple, and I think you started to see things Tether on top of Mastercoin, become Omni, like all these color coins, like some of these concepts started to add more weight to the chain, and they started to create more opinions about where it should go. And then you started to have all these Bitcoin forks of random stuff, Dogecoin, all that other stuff. But in the really early days, it was, this is interesting tech, this is cool. And so, yeah, I'm trying to recall, I remember one of the random connections was through our door lock company. We had two kinds of door locks. We had one that you could put on like a normal house, but we also had an electronic one for like an apartment buzzer. And we installed those across all these hacker houses in SF, where they would have like, I don't know, 10 to 20 people living in practically a converted warehouse. And one or two of those were, at least one of them was a very Bitcoin focused place, but it was like, oh, cool. Like that's where the Bitcoin guys are. And like, you know, I say generally like people interested, not specific developers, although I'm sure some of them went through there. And you could go to fairly small meetups, talk to the devs, talk about it. Local Bitcoins was a massive thing. You could go meet up in parks, buy Bitcoins, trade Bitcoins. You could actually spend it. And so it was a very naive tech-focused part. And I'm saying I'm on the naive side. I always joke about, with folks like Tyler and others from that era, there's sort of two ways that people found out about Bitcoin in that time period. The first was you're a total nerd, you're in Silicon Valley, you're in this environment, and you're like, oh, cool, I'm gonna mine this. And the second was Silk Road. Those were basically the binary sides. And I think that those two influences really influenced the growth of Bitcoin since then. That you still have kind of the Silk Road adjacent, like we're gonna do somewhat bad or naughty stuff with this because we can. And then the really tech nerdy people who are like, this is just cool tech, I wanna build it. And so it was really innocent. It was really innocent until everybody started to make money, and everybody started to make money. You know, the true people who had thousands of Bitcoin in the 2013 era, all of a sudden they wake up and they're millionaires. And that was the switch that flipped. Then you start to get all of the interest in other chains and, you know, shitcoining and all of that stuff. That's where it emerged from. But yeah, I mean, otherwise it's like, well, go hang out on Bitcoin Talk and talk through some of this. You know, I think it was really interesting when Satoshi disappeared, because in the really early days it was like technical, you know, cryptography mailing lists and stuff like that, and it's like, oh, okay, I guess we'll never figure out who that guy was. But it wasn't this whole, he wasn't built up as he was today. It's like, okay, somebody just wants to stay anonymous. And I think in 2026 it's way harder to imagine remaining anonymous because of the surveillance capabilities of all states are just improved so much. But at the time, that may have been one of the last periods of time where you could just kind of disappear like that. So yeah, it was very naive. And I think, as with many things, the moment people start to make money, things get pulled in a different direction. And so fast forward to, we had an office in 2016, and this is where we started to see stuff in crypto. So before the big run up, it was the Ethereum thing with the Airbnb on Ethereum, and people started to talk a little bit more about crypto. I used to go to this recurring meetup in 2016, and I remember there were a few people working on really interesting uses of Bitcoin for blockchain, sort of like open timestamp, but using it for medical products and things like that. One of the companies was called
Medical records on the blockchain.
Right. Chronicled. I remember meeting one of the founders from that company, and so people were really, and Silicon Valley at that time still took it seriously. Like VCs were like, oh yeah, like there's this interesting tech, the blockchain, and you can put things onto it, and the data will stay there forever. So by 2016 though, because of the run up and the crash, the money, things like, people had to start thinking about their security. And so the funny thing is, we were in this office building, kind of like a mini office park that had about 10 startups in it. And we didn't learn until we were moving out, like the office 2 doors down from us was like I think it was like a Blockstream office. And it was very quiet, and like every so often you could see, you know, like Greg Maxwell coming and going, but it was like a lot of core devs just like 2 doors down from us. And I think people were starting to think a lot more about like, oh man, like I'm the face of this, or I don't want people coming after me because of the money being involved in it. So by the point of 2017 and that first run up, yeah, it was, I think 2017 was the big divide between this is cool tech, and it might be cool tech, and this is actually a real thing. It is money, and we need to think very differently about it. We need to get much more serious and much more professional about it. And I know 2017 is already 9 years ago, and it seems like that's a long time ago, but that's when things started to change. And then obviously it was the block size wars, and then the whole Bitcoin Cash forking, like that changed a lot for people. People were terrified. It was like, are we gonna survive this? What's gonna happen? If you're on the wrong exchange, will you get the right fork? And you know, credit to Coinbase, and lots of people have lots of stories around Coinbase and the issues there, but like they were pretty quick to give people both of the forks and let the market decide. And they were a very savvy company, we'll put it that way. But yeah, that sort of original spirit of being able to, go to the meetups, 2012, 2013, talk to people, have friends. There wasn't this reaction, you know, when you used to talk to non-Bitcoiners in that period of time, 2009 to 2016, it was like, oh, that's a cool tech. It's like, oh, interesting, tell me about it. Oh, okay, like you can have this digital money, interesting. But there was none of this like, screw those crypto people, screw the Bitcoiners, like blah, 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 or like hate those guys. There was none of that. There was no political polarization around it that you see today. And yeah, as a result, you can see certain ecosystems, like we were a Y Combinator company, like Y Combinator for years funded no crypto company. companies. Like there were a couple of early ones. There was a Bitcoin ATM company. So we were one of the few hardware companies in this Bitcoin ATM company. I think they were Canadian. Was one of the other ones. They're one of the big ones. They were a YC company 2014 or something like that.
General Bytes?
I think it may have been. Yeah, I'm trying to remember the name of the, I don't know if they named the ATMs General Bytes, but
Lamasu? I don't think so.
No, it might come to me later on. So they're a YC company, obviously Coinbase, but there are a number of other companies back in the day where they would accept Bitcoin through e-commerce, like they were open to it. And then obviously what would become Filecoin, Wambane went through YC. So there are these early crypto companies, but then there was a shift, and I think it was 2017, and all of the ICOs and the scams and everything, and basically it just became toxic. Like that reflected back on Bitcoin and people really trying to build stuff, and it became persona non grata. You couldn't talk seriously to people anymore about Bitcoin because it was like, oh, you're just trying to pump and scam me and dump on me, even though, you know, it wasn't inherent to Bitcoin, but there were a lot of ICO scams and places where people lost money. And so that era then from 2017 to 2021, you know, people talk about us being in a bear market now or entering into a bear market, but that was to stick around in the 2017 to the 2021 era for when things started to come back in that cycle. That was a tough set of years. I mean, that was a real, like, people would look at you and they're like, oh man, like, so tell me about your scam coins again or whatever, and tell me, like, what do you do? And yeah, you know, that when Bitcoin hit whatever it was, $3,000 in 2020, that was quite the psychological low for a lot of people in the space. But then, you know, Bitcoin Miami 2021, a year later, was incredible. It was like a bunch of people are like, yeah, like stuff is happening here. So, and the nice thing is everyone who survived through that time, it's like you finally got to see the build out of things like Lightning and other tools that just make it easier beyond obviously like physical cash things that we're doing. But, you know, I think being in the space for a long time, and I don't want to focus on Lightning. It's incredible to use it. I like using it, but I don't have any purism around if it's custodial Bitcoin in any way, whether to me I'm using Lightning or I have it with a different custodian in some form. And obviously I could run my own Lightning node, but a lot of people don't do that. I'm not that picky. I don't want it to be sitting in a Lightning channel for years though. I want my Bitcoin to be somewhere safe. And so I think the interesting thing is now, being around the space for a long time, I think it's great to have, one should start to bifurcate in their mind, they're spending Bitcoin and they're saving Bitcoin, and have like clarity in where those two things live. But to your original question about like projecting forward 10 years, 20 years, where that goes, I mean, you have a lot of tugging and pulling on different sides right now. It's like we went through, I would say, a relative calm period. Like after the block size wars and Lightning, the things became very slow around development, and that was a good thing. And obviously there's still debates around certain opcodes and whether we should bring back certain things, and the debates around NFTs on Bitcoin, and if you're just weighing down the chain with all this junk data. But like, I would say that stuff is sort of like inside baseball for Bitcoin. Like it doesn't really matter in the greater world around the store value use case. And I say that being a person who's somewhat distanced from it, but like, to me, whether or not there's Bitcoin is purely a monetary chain or you allow NFTs, I'm not gonna really dive into one side or another super strongly. But I am really concerned looking forward towards some of the existential risks around Bitcoin that are coming down the pike, and those are really concerning to me. And I think the thing is, people debate about the timing of them. And so obviously, you know, one that's come up over the last few years is the viability and the profitability around mining in the distant future. I don't think we really need to worry about that now, but I think the discussions we have around are important. But I do think that I guess I'm a 21 million maximalist. I think that's important, but I think we need to think about solutions. And then, yeah, I do think there's very viable arguments around quantum. I have friends who work in the space. I don't think Bitcoin keys are going to be cracked tomorrow or in the next year or 2 years, but I do think on the 5-year time horizon, this is a very concerning problem. And one of the biggest problems with it is, even if we come up with a brilliant solution, the migration path to it might take a really long time. And so I do think that, unfortunately, that early day OG sort of naiveness of like, oh, let's build a cool tech and try to solve these problems, is really hard to pull off now in the current environment. And to be fair, I mean, it's a multi-trillion-dollar asset, so I get it. It's going to be hard to direct the ship one way or another. But yeah, I do think that quantum is a growing existential risk, and it's because of multiple things. Like, for a long time when I read about quantum, it was like, okay, you need this many, even 6 months ago, like, oh, you need this many physical qubits, and we might have like half a dozen, and you need multiple million physical qubits to do this. It's like so far down the line. But what's happening now is more money has gone into quantum, so that's helping to accelerate the chip development. And then you have people who are working on these algorithmic ways to basically say, well, we can reduce from 2 million to 1 million to 100,000 physical qubits now in order to attack a key. And it's like, okay, that like safety margin is starting to compress significantly, and we really need to think carefully about that. Like, what is the plan? What will be the plan? And I know there's a lot of devs working on it, but I am a little concerned that when push comes to shove, this is likely going to be the next biggest and potentially last meaningful hard fork in Bitcoin. So,
to be honest, and I'm gonna check the camera once again to be sure that everything is recorded and fine. To be honest, I do hope that it's gonna be a hard fork, because that's the most elegant way to migrate to a new chain that's quantum resistant. If it's gonna be a soft fork, this means that every user is gonna have to move the coins, the UTXOs, to an address that is quantum resistant. And that doesn't scale. That's gonna make the migration expensive for the user. And it can also leave some inactive users like Satoshi vulnerable. And I would be much more in favor of doing a hard fork that fixes a lot of the existing problems that people have been complaining about. Of course, the concern around the hard fork is that it's gonna create an altcoin, meaning that part of the community is still gonna want to use the old chain, and maybe that the exchanges will be confused as to which one gets the ticker, and that's always a challenge to understand which one is like the true network. And yeah, I'm not a big fan of soft forking this particular feature, which is quantum resistance, because it makes it opt-in, so only the users that do want to activate that and move their coins into a quantum resistant address will benefit from it, which means that most users will be vulnerable, especially the long-term holders, or even people who locked their coins for, say, 20 years or something. That's also a thing. There are people who put multi-sigs for their children or whatever, and they made it so that the coins cannot be spent for a very long time.
Yeah, I think there's the nuances around those discussions are really important, because of as people started to use Miniscript when that came out and like got into Bitcoin script, it's like, oh, I can actually do much more interesting custody solutions than just a single key, and I can do it in a purely Bitcoin way, no crazy external other chains or other things like that. But there's two other big concerns that I really have. So the first one is hardware. The post-quantum cryptographic standards, none of those are hardware accelerated today. It's coming, but they're not. And so that means for folks like ourselves, but also ledgers and treasures, the hardware key storage is going to become really hard again with post-quantum. Like, we're going to have this period where there's likely a post-quantum option, but you won't be able to have a hardware key store that works in the same way at least existing hardware key stores do. So you're going to have this gap. And The good news is the chips will catch up because they all have to follow the NIST standards for government and banking applications. So sort of like crypto users get the benefits of that. We get the fact that these chips are going to pick up. But the problem is they will choose certain post-quantum specs for banking, TLS government applications, and we might choose different ones for Bitcoin. And so all of a sudden we might have this gap where you again need to go back to the OG days of having like an isolated machine with like a Tails instance on Linux to like boot up and get your keys safely to be a self-custody user. So the hardware is going to be a big challenge, and so we're watching that very closely. But the second piece is, and I think this is a positive piece, whether or not post-quantum happens or a key gets cracked in 2 years or 10 years, there are good aspects, or not good aspects to that, but there are means of protection. So when one really thinks through it, and I think a lot of people have debated like, okay, like whose keys will be cracked first? Will it be the Satoshi wallets or not? And realistically, any smart person who's figured out how to crack keys, cracking the Satoshi wallets is probably a bad idea because the moment those funds start to move, the market freaks out and it crashes. So you'll likely want to find whales who have a wallet with UTXOs that they've spent, so you have on-chain signatures, and they haven't done any movement in 10 to 15 years. So you have a segment of wallets there that will likely get cracked first. Just this past cycle, I mean, where you saw some whales moving, you know, mid 2025 or close to end of 2025, that actually looks like a perfect like target for quantum hacks. So if someone had a quantum computer already, I'd say they were likely the ones who were cracked. But I think some of those wallets were unspent, which means it's depending on whether they have a very old school style wallet where you're paying to hash or not, it's not crackable. So the next thing I'll say about this is, okay, so they're the most at risk at first. The smartest thing you can do if you want to store Bitcoin for a long time in a self-custodied way is just create a new wallet, send funds to it, and never do anything on chain with that wallet again. Because the way that quantum works in cracking the signatures is you need to be able to look on chain and see a spent transaction, a revealed public key basically, in order to then go and crack that public key to get the private key. So you have a large margin of safety there to say, okay, like you won't be crackable. So then the next problem becomes, great, there's quantum computers. I have this wallet where I left money for 10 years, BTC. Now I want to go off and spend it. Like, how do I do that without getting cracked? Well, the next good news is these attacks will be really costly and slow to begin with. And so by that I mean, A, they'll require large amount of computation of quantum computers, possibly networked over large distances in order to do this to begin with. But B, the cracking time will likely be much, much longer than the 12-minute block time. So you'll have a window where even if you're storing a fairly large amount of funds, and I mean large amount, like millions, probably it's dangerous, tens of millions or hundreds, but say hundreds of thousands or millions, where you're not a big target, and the moment that it's revealed that someone has publicly broken a key, you'll be able to spend out of your UTXO into hopefully a post-quantum scheme or something like that. So there'll be a good amount of time where you'll be able to do that. And only when it becomes A, really cheap, and B, faster than the 12-minute block times as it gets scary. But even in that scenario, I suspect there will be specialized Bitcoin RPCs or recovery services or private networks where you basically have to trust that they're not going to quantum break your keys, but you'll be able to spend through them and have them broadcast to the network at that point in time. So I think that even when keys start getting broken, we still have a long way. I think the scary thing is around the market might get very choppy in terms of adoption, and people will start dumping Bitcoin because they're freaked out about this. And again, if one starts to use Bitcoin personally as a unit of account, then that's okay. But you know, if the price is changing too much, then that's too tricky. So yeah, I think the quantum future is scary. I think the reality of it is we have ways to migrate and things will be safe-ish for a while. But I do think culturally it's going to be very hard to get everybody in a room to agree that, like, let's just say, yes, we agree on a hard fork. What's the curve is going to be, what the mechanism for migration is going to be. Because again, if you have an older hardware wallet and it can't sign a post-quantum claiming mechanism on the new chain, like, you might be screwed. So yeah, there's a lot of different aspects that need to be considered there.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's for a good purpose.
Right.
I don't think there's a greater threat to Bitcoin right now. Maybe just an inflation bug. Maybe that one is something that can destroy it. But if you can have, and just for the record, quantum computers can't steal everyone's coins. They have to target a specific UTXO and brute force it by determining the private key from the public key, which is a very computation intensive process. If you hold like $100 of Bitcoin in a UTXO, it's more expensive to actually attack you than the reward for attacking you. So you're probably safe. I guess one good way to be quantum resistant is to have lots of small UTXOs in a wallet, and quantum computers will not care about that one. But for exchanges and for these ETFs and their custodian, which is Coinbase in I think most cases, it's kind of frightening. And I do understand why there's an institutional push for quantum resistant cryptography. There's also a lot of experimentation, like we're not even sure what kind of signatures we should be using. There's Lamport, there's Winternitz, there are a lot of different kinds of models. And no matter what you choose, you're gonna have larger transaction sizes, which means that you're gonna make Bitcoin even less scalable than it was before. So it is very interesting, and it's worth thinking about all of these challenges. The problem is the cultural complacency, which I notice, where people point out, like, let's say that Nick Carter tweets out and says Bitcoin needs to become quantum resistant. The average quote-unquote pleb is going to reply to that with a link to BIP 360, which is still a proposal. It's not something that actually happened. It's not something that is final. It's still being refined. And when you see that, and that people are so confident about Bitcoin just because there's a proposal, which once again is not final, we're not even sure that will be the one that's gonna get activated, it just proves that, I don't know, it's very hard to get consensus on anything, and if you come up with something better and it's not supported by the right people, which means that it would have social consensus, it's gonna be tough. And that's the kind of thing that makes me worried about Bitcoin. It's not a very good open source project for developers. It's actually very cronyist in some ways. Like, unless you get the endorsement of a handful of people for something, the blessing that this can happen, it's most likely not gonna happen. And I say it because I've seen what happened with CTV, which is BIP 119 by Jeremy Rubin. He's been the subject of character assassination for like 5 years now, and they're making fun of him and saying that he's some sort of government agent. The fact that he's in the Epstein files doesn't help him at all, because he was at MIT for a while and he was receiving some sort of scholarship from the Digital Currency Initiative. So yeah, but his invention, the CTV, has been tested and has been around for a long time. Nobody could find issues with it. Nobody claimed any bounty on any of the known attack vectors. And I'm genuinely worried that we sort of lost this critical thinking, which might have been something that was due to a higher centralization, where you had a bunch of smart people and everyone trusted them. Now people are very paranoid and they say, well, don't mess with my money, don't do this, don't do that. What if there's some sort of evil piece of code in here which is gonna make it easy for people to inflate Bitcoin or for someone to steal my coins, which is a legit concern, but you have AI if you want to do some code review.
Right.
Like, how do you view this? Because I see other chains that make changes and they hard fork regularly, and they don't seem to have the issue of having like a lingering community which sticks with the old chain. Even in the case of Ethereum, you had Ethereum Classic, which I respect. I think it's a very interesting and principled project, but it never took off.
Right. Yeah, it is really interesting to look at the cultures of the different chains and the technical cultures and how distinct they are. The Ethereum world is really interesting. I think in large part, and everyone has talked all about this, but with Bitcoin, the creator went away. And with these other chains, the creators have not gone away. And obviously with Ethereum, Vitalik is the face of that. And he sort of comes in and out depending on like his importance with it, but he has an outsized impact on it. I mean, just recently he had this whole blog post talking about how L2s are going to have to differentiate to be valuable, and everybody's like, what the hell? You told us we need L2s to scale years ago. And I've lived through all this. I've deployed tens of thousands of contracts on Ethereum, which is absurd, but it was because our Kong cash notes, every single one of them had an Ethereum contract, not a factory contract where you could just clone them, like individually deploy contracts. And back in 2019, you could do that. ETH was $90. It was one way to deploy it, and it was just very cheap to deploy contracts.
What year was that?
2019. It was ETH dropped to around like 100. I think it was like low hundreds, and then it like bottomed out around $90 some. And so
I do remember Arthur Hayes of BitMEX posted a blog post that was called Ethereum, the 2-digit shitcoin.
Yeah, right. And it was like, from a developer perspective, I was deploying contracts like, this is great. Like, I could map it out. And I think even though it was some million gas per contract deployment, I'm like, okay, great. We paid $5 to manufacture each note, but it'll be like 25 cents to deploy the smart contract. That's totally fine. And then what happened was, as gas prices started to jump up the next year because of NFTs and stuff, we could no longer do that. We had to totally rework everything. I'm like, yeah, I can't spend $50 per note to deploy a contract. And then factory patterns and all this other stuff came in and solved it. But what I'm getting at is culturally, Vitalik came in and he's like, we need to scale this. And then, way back in the day, it was plasma and sharding and all these other things that didn't really come to fruition. But then, Raiden Network, there are a lot of these early OG projects that worked on it. And the problem was none of them, I don't really know, none of them really had the blessing until Optimism. And I think the reason Optimism as an L2 really had that was because you had some just OG ETH people there who knew the ins and outs of like getting the support from the EF. And it's not fair to say, but I think that's the case. And to be fair, you also had Polygon, who was really hustling, and they got the NFT crowd on there. But really it was Optimism who said, okay, we're gonna do this, and then we're gonna open source it and make it this pattern, and now you have Base and all these other ones. And so it's now funny to fast forward today where it's all sort of collapsing down because it's wartime Ethereum and everybody needs to use the L1 and we need to make it faster and we can to compete with things like Solana and other chains like that. But yeah, I mean, it's because there's still this top-down dictatorial force in Ethereum who's able to say that. And I don't mean that in a bad way, I mean that in a good way, that we're able to see through, because if we were just stuck with the Ethereum of 2017, it would have been far surpassed long ago. And I agree with you around the fork with ETH Classic. It was a very principled thing to do, but I think it demonstrated that the culture around Ethereum is very distinct. And it's distinct in the sense that people said, look, like, yeah, this whole situation sucks. It's crazy that we had to do this, but we're going to keep going with the teams that are going to continue to iterate. And so to this day, the fact that you have so many different consensus client teams in the Ethereum ecosystem, obviously funded through grants from the EF, but independently building, is really massive. You don't have nearly that diversity in Bitcoin. You have a big diversity of teams in Ethereum who are building, but you still have the sort of top-down, like, here's what you're going to build and here's how you're going to do it. So I think there's good and bad of that. I think, the parity hack that came later on after the DAO hack was another test of like, oh man, are we going to go through this again and fork? And the fact that Ethereum didn't was like probably a good sign of maturity, that'll work. But obviously Ethereum has really suffered on the store value narrative. I mean, the Ethereum price is, there's all these jokes of like being an Ethereum holder and like it hasn't done much. And it is remarkable though how now mainstream financial products and banks and institutions are using effectively L1 through other means, and yet it's not reflected in the price. And again, it's cultural. I mean, early on in 2019, I remember the DevCon Osaka there, if you talked about building a coin for your project, you were shunned. After the ICO days, it was a 180, and in the Ethereum community, it's like, if you talk about having another coin, like no way. Even if you're the most authentic builder who is really trying to build a utility and think about it, it was like, why do you need another coin? Just use ETH. And then what happened is genuine builders said, okay, well, I'm going to build stuff without other coins. And then once again, when price and stuff started to pump in 2021, you had a lot of people who sold great narratives, launched other coins, and it's like, oh, okay, actually I should have done another coin. Like some of the biggest people who are anti-coin then proceeded to go launch their own coins. And so it's really easy as a builder in the space to get caught up in all this and sort of disenfranchised and be like, well, why did I follow what they're saying? And so now I would say we have a very pragmatic approach of it needs to be fast and it needs to be cheap for the applications that we do there. We haven't really talked about stablecoins. I think that there's a lot of opinions around stablecoins, but they're really powerful because they're finally getting people to use blockchain technology or not. They're hyper centralized. They have like big banks behind, like they're institutional. Maybe they're a path to CBDCs. Like I don't really necessarily think so, but I think the most powerful thing about it is like they're bringing the same tools of self-custody that you need for Bitcoin to millions and millions of more users. And so they're basically building out, they're paying for the build out of the tech platform so that if one needed to flip the switch and be like, actually I need non-sovereign money because these stablecoins aren't worth anything, that exists. So I actually think they're critical in doing that, whether or not one sees it as a shitcoin or not. But yeah, from our perspective, we just have to choose, we have to choose economic choices and what's cheap and fast and reasonable. And yeah, today that means L2s. Maybe if ETH changes things in the future, it'll be back on L1. And Solana luckily has had a cleaner narrative around this, but I do personally believe they have much more inherent natural centralization because of the requirements of running Solana nodes are just so steep. You were talking a little bit earlier around lottery mining and stuff. I mean, I hadn't mined since the 2011 days, and then a few months ago I bought a BitAxe just to play around with it because it's super cool. And I'm like conceptually, at first I didn't get it, being like, having mined way back when, I'm like, wait, this single chip, like I'm never gonna get a block, like, well, I don't understand. And I'm like, oh, versus me going out and buying lottery tickets, like statistically, this is much, much better lottery mining than doing that. So like, yeah, I'm not going to submit this to a pool. And I love it. It's another way to get people interested in Bitcoin. It's a fairly low cost. It doesn't draw a ton of energy. I think I check it, it's like 60 watts. And I like the idea of participating in the network again. It's really cool.
I've been holding the burner card like this to the camera. Another alternative to the BitAxe is called the BMM, which is the Bitcoin mini miner, and if you're listening to this, you can get a 5% discount with promo code BTCTKVR. I just remembered about this. And about stablecoins, I'm gonna be done with the ads in like 2 minutes. Usually I tell people to use SideShift to swap their stablecoins for sound money, because in the case of stablecoins, you never know exactly where they come from. Some people offer to pay you with them, and then you can realize that Tether freezes your funds or whatever, and that's not something that can happen with Bitcoin or Ethereum or Litecoin or whatever it is that you like. But you have all of these on SideShift, and what you can do is just paste your Bitcoin address, you click the shift button, and then you're gonna get a stablecoin address that you send to the person wanting to pay you, and then there's gonna be a swap that you don't have to know anything about. You don't need gas to pay fees, you don't need any of that, and you receive what you want directly to your address, which I think is very convenient. and the URL is Sideshift, which is SIDESHIFT.ai. There is also Layer 2 Labs, which is sponsoring this show, and Layer 2 Labs is trying to build a sidechain for every interesting altcoin out there. So the vision is to have, it's very 2014-ish from the time when Blockstream published their paper, but the idea is to have everything on Bitcoin using BTC with sidechains which are enforced by miners. Right now the software is in production. You can check it out at layer2labs.com/download. Unfortunately, it only works on the Bitcoin Signet, so it's not on the LiveNet. I don't know when we're gonna get that. I do hope it's gonna happen, but you can see what the future of Bitcoin can look like with a Ethereum sidechain, with a Zcash sidechain, with a prediction market, with, I think there's also a Namecoin sidechain, and the Big Block sidechain, which works for pretty much all the low fee transactions with high frequency and fast blocks, and it gets pruned every 6 months, so you don't have to store a lot of data. I think it's very interesting, and you can check it all out. And what's the other sponsor? No offense. I'm just tired. There's one more. Oh, Bitcoin.com news. Yeah, they rebranded. They used to be green. They were saying that Bitcoin Cash is faster and cheaper. Yep. Now their logo is orange, and they have news about BTC, and they know the difference between BTC and BCH. And I like their editorial team, and I also recommend them because they're like the middle ground between CoinDesk, which is very institutional, and Bitcoin Magazine, which focuses too much on politics. So it's a good place to find news about stuff that you did not know about, which is sort of the point of news, not just reinforcing conviction into something or trying to get you to stick to a narrative, which I think is the bane of our existence in this space. So check it out, it's news.bitcoin.com. And let's talk more about Burner, because I feel like we started out with this. I also want to ask you about scaling and privacy in Bitcoin, which is a broader, more interesting topic. But if you have a phone, can you demo how this works in front of the camera?
Yeah, we'll do a quick demo. Unfortunately, this one is not loaded, but it means I get to set it up. Oh, perfect.
You need both hands.
Yep.
So I'm gonna be holding the microphone. I like your iPhone 17 Pro case, which is orange.
Yep, it's an orange iPhone as well. I just like to keep it protected. So Burner is fully NFC based. Tap it to your phone, bring up the browser here, and again, all the steps are just going to be through Safari here. So I'll go ahead and get started. This is Burner OS. We have open source libraries to interface with this as well. I'll get to that a little bit later. Burner will as a hardware wallet self-generate its own key, or you can request that it generates a new key and you can add your own entropy. Now there's one aspect to this. The entropy that you add during key generation, it actually gets hashed and mixed with entropy from the RNG. And people say, well, why is that? Why can't I just keep my key as well? The idea is if you're gifting this, we don't want the private key to ever be externally known. We don't want you to have a copy which can be stolen or social engineered. So all private key material on this version of Burner lives internal to here. But again, you can add your own entropy if you don't trust us and you want to add something to it. So I'm going to go ahead and trust the project that I built. And then it's managed by a simple pin code. So I'm going to set up a really generic one, what I call the Kanye of all zeros. So we have this here, set pin code, and every time you need to interface the card, it prompts you and you tap it. Name your wallet. We'll call this gift BTC. Okay, great. Set the name. Once again, I tap it. Perfect. And so boom, I have this simple kind of retro vibe web interface where now I can add some Bitcoin on here. We also have a means where you can, through unfortunately KYC process, I need to work with one of your sponsors on this, you can trade it into USDC. So you can get in and out of USDC and Bitcoin, that's it. You can always withdraw your Bitcoin from this. And then we have a cool card duplicator function. So let's just say you want to use this for your own personal storage. You can copy one burner to another one. It doesn't expose private key material. we have this cool encrypted sort of like a TLS session that you establish between the two burners, and it duplicates the card. You know that the cards are duplicated. You can see here we indicate that. And then likewise, we'll also indicate to you if a card has been spent or not. So actually, I'll hand you back the mic here. We'll do a check on this one. If you get a card, let's just say from Amazon, you're like, I don't know, did someone do some crazy stuff to this? We can retrieve the status here, and we can hold it up and see if great, we have a lock, which means that the key on this has never been used to sign a transaction at all. So it's basically sealed. Similar to kind of like Open Dime in that sense, but more of like an easy tap NFC Open Dime. So maybe in the background here, I can try to add some cash to it. It'll take a little bit of while with the block times. But yeah, really meant to be just a super simple interface. So now actually, you could tap this to your phone, and let's just say I add $100 worth of BTC on here. You can immediately access it. Of course, I have to give you the PIN code as well. That's the one caveat. The nice thing about the PIN code, of course, is let's say I carry some BTC with me and I have a backed up one at home. I lose my wallet, someone steals it. The wallet will permanently lock after 20 bad PIN code attempts. And with a 6-digit PIN, you have plenty of key space, so that it's very unlikely that they randomly guess your PIN code.
Right, so basically you have this NFC card. Let me check the camera quickly. Yeah, we're still rolling for 1 hour, 21 minutes. Super cool. So the data gets written all the time on the NFC card. Like the PIN is stored on the card, and the information about it having been used before is also stored on the card. It's not on your servers, right?
Right. So first and foremost, I describe this as NFC. It's very different than an NFC tag you buy off the shelf. So you could go on Amazon and buy an NFC tag for, I don't know, $1 to $10. This is really a secure element with an NFC front end coupled together. And so what that means is all of these actions we're talking about, the verification of the PIN code, the key generation, all that occurs within the secure element of this. It's a similar class of chip as you'll find in a Ledger and a Trezor, but it's just not battery powered. It's fully inductively powered by the NFC. But all those functions at a low level go directly to the burner. So we have this extremely simple looking trivial interface, and I think sometimes people think that we're doing secret things with a server and checking on stuff. No, you could basically take a burner with an offline laptop and fully interface with it. We actually have like a command line interface and an API, totally open, and interface with the card in order to have it sign transactions. And so if you go there, you have to submit your PIN via command line in order to request that it sign a signature over a transaction. But everything is designed to be still a very secure hardware wallet, but it's marketed in a sort of a playful, fun, simple way as opposed to a complicated one. And so when you compare it to something like a Ledger or a Trezor, the biggest difference is you don't have a screen. You have to trust the screen that you're using. It simplifies things a lot on our end, but it also means if for some reason you think your laptop or your phone is compromised, you probably want to wait to use that. So you want to have a clean machine or a clean phone. We think that on certain things like iPhones, the likelihood of attack is fairly low, but there are browser level attacks. And so the other thing you always want to check is going to our website. So burner.pro, when that's secured, HTTPS, I think it's bitcoin.burner.pro is our Bitcoin app. You have confidence that that's the right website versus some hacked website or something like that. But yeah, the attack vectors are very different as a result. I would say because we rely on the interface, there's more trust there than what you see on the screen of a Ledger. But then also because it's non-firmware updatable, once it leaves the factory, we can't change the firmware, you can't change the firmware. It just limits the whole scope of attacks. You're not going to be upgrading the card. The idea is, let's say we add on some new features that we can't do in hardware. There's a lot of stuff we could do in software. So we could build in like a vaulting function, which we have not done yet, but thought about, where you tap multiple burners to create a vault with a script. But that would all be software. If we ever had some hardware upgrade, say to add post-quantum or something like that, your path is to buy a new burner. But again, it's not $100, it's $9. So the goal is we make it very easy for that to happen. And yeah, I think, again, deceptively simple, but actually a fairly sophisticated process going on.
2 questions that I have from this point on. What are the wallets, like, is there any third-party wallet support for burner? And secondly, how do you guys make money? Because for what I know, this is like $10 and you can pay that for the NFC chip by itself. So how is this a profitable business?
So your first question, sorry, repeat your first question. Third-party wallets. We do not have third-party wallet integration. We would love it. We would love to integrate with any wallets interested. We have open APIs. We have spoken to third-party wallets. I think there's a few challenges. The main one is there's a standard around third-party wallets, which is a cold card standard or kind of presented by those folks. And that's basically about revealing the key, and then the wallet can then use the key for operations. We could do that. We could build a different key slot. We have multiple key slots in the chip. We could build a different key slot that works that way. But we just worry that that's a bit of a foot gun for newbies to be like, oh, I went through this process and then the key is revealed. And it's like, oh man, like you better spend that because it just broke all of our security assumptions. So that's one of the reasons why we don't have compatibility, but there's no reason why we couldn't. We have SDKs for iOS, Android, React web apps. You can even use this on a desktop. It's pretty cool. We have this QR code method where you go to the burner app on your desktop in a web browser, and then the QR code will link your phone as an NFC reader, or you can plug in a USB NFC reader. We have a way to use that. But yeah, we would love to integrate with third-party wallets. Doesn't exist today, so you have to use our open libraries. And then how do we make money? So we've been sourcing these chips in volume for years. I mean, really, really big volume. So we pay a lot less than what you would expect. But the next piece of where we go is kind of towards, I'd say, some of it is standard ways of making money around wallets. So you can trade into USD. I don't believe we take a fee there right now, but that's something where we could charge a small trading fee. Off-ramping, we don't charge a fee, but I think we could reasonably charge a small off-ramping fee there. But ultimately, the big thing we're moving towards is payments. We think that, I talked about these OG payment experiments. We think that payments with crypto the time is finally now for why it makes sense for that to happen. And so, yeah, that's where we announced this new product, Burner Terminal. It's a point of sale devices for small businesses to accept payments. And the cool thing is with burners, we can do a true tap to pay experience that feels like a credit card. There's no QR codes, no scanning. You can tap it, and you can set thresholds so that above a certain amount, you have to enter in a PIN code, but otherwise it feels just like a Visa or MasterCard experience.
Not that there's anything wrong with QR codes. Just yesterday I went to Chipotle and I had Mexican food with Zuko, and I was able to pay directly from the Zashi wallet, which I think is going to be called Zadl from now on. And what it did was generate a coupon that I scanned at the counter, and that's how I paid for everything. And I think Flexa is like doing all the magic in the background, so congratulations, Tyler. That was very good. Another question about Burner: which are the coins that you currently support, and what else do you plan to support?
Yeah, so on the Bitcoin version, we support just native Bitcoin, so you hold your own Bitcoin. We've considered supporting Lightning. Don't have anything to announce there, but maybe down the road we will. We have an Ethereum product, and the Ethereum product obviously supports any tokens on Ethereum. We decided to go with a limited set of L2s, which, given the whole recent Vitalik blog post, I'm happy about. We chose that ahead of time because we want to keep the product simple. So the L2s we support easily are Base, Optimism, Arbitrum. At some point, I think we probably support Polygon, but we don't today. And the reason why we want to do that, again, was simplicity. There's so many potential L2s, and I don't think they're going to all exist for that much longer. You can just add on a lot of complexity for a new user to be like, hey, here's this thing, and then it's like, wait, what's the network selector? What chain am I on? It's purely software. So the cool thing is if for some reason we were like, oh, this is an L2 that makes sense for support, or another EVM chain, we can actually add that on pretty simply. We have considered a Solana product. We don't have it today. It's probably in the works. There's some challenges there that are distinct. And then we would love to do products around ZK and privacy networks, but they fundamentally just use very different cryptographic primitives that are hard to get us to work in our sort of hardware. And so keep in mind, with us, we have this whole browser interface where you tap it. That tap is a very fast interaction. Even with something like a ledger, they have a built-in battery, and so you're able to wait around a little bit longer, say in the case of Zcash or some of these other privacy coins, to do the transactions. That said, we recently we started to work with folks with wrapped coins, which is great if you're gifting a small amount of wrapped coins. So there's now a Xano burner, and I know they're doing that as a limited handout for folks, and so you can get wrapped Xano on the card, and then we have a link in the card where you can tap it, and then you can go unwrap your Xano. And so I think that's a nice way to just get people exposed to privacy coins and different chains that we otherwise couldn't easily support. We've also thought about other L1s that don't necessarily have specific privacy features and that are kind of like OG Bitcoin clones. But the challenge there is we don't want to offer too many SKUs. You could easily have like a burner card for every coin out there, and we want to make sure that it makes sense. Lastly, I'd add on, we could in theory have a unified burner that supports all the coins, and I think that would appeal to some folks. But we still just love the simplicity of like, I like knowing where my BTC burner is versus my Ethereum stuff, because it also just changes how I sign on it. Like my ETH, on ETH, you're signing for stuff all the time and you're doing transactions for smaller things. With BTC, I like the fact that I'm not like, signing all the time on stuff, and I can receive a bunch of UTXOs and spend them out as needed.
Where does the name burner come from? Is it like a burner phone, which is something that you only use once and then throw away? And also, can you name 5 coins which are not absolute shit coins?
So yeah, you hit the nail on the head with the name. The name is meant to be completely ironic. We see all of these products that are selling themselves as like vaults or secure this or secure that. And having worked on secure chips for a long time, they're very good. The state of the art of secure chips is very good, but the state of the art is always changing. And so inevitably in 5-10 years, like someone will hack the chips. And hopefully the goal is they hack the chip in a way where they have to like, I don't know, put it under electron scanning microscope, and it takes a ton of skill and power and manpower to hack one chip. But eventually like all chips will be hacked. And so we hated the idea of pitching security for the sake of security. There's a lot of companies who market it. I think some companies legitimately can take that title and back up their claims, but to me it just felt scammy to go down that path. So we said, why don't we invert the model and we use this term burner, which like a burner phone is throwaway, despite the fact that it is in fact a very secure product and it has a state-of-the-art secure element in it. And we really like that. And it also has a history of burner software wallets. In the Ethereum ecosystem, Austin Griffith, who's an OG Ethereum dev, had this project called Burner Wallet back in the 2018, 2019 days. Browser-based wallet, your key was generated there, wasn't meant to hold a bunch of cash. And so, yeah, we like the history and the idea of burner wallets. Basically, is between that or say paper wallet, but paper physically would have been confusing. So burner wallet made the most sense. In terms of 5 other coins that I think are interesting, I mean, yeah, I obviously like, I love Bitcoin. I've been through the trenches on ETH. I, held Sol through the crash and up and down, but leaving those aside, my latest personal narrative is around back to store value. I think that store value coins are really interesting. I don't think like endless L1 coins are interesting except for maybe some of the privacy ones. So I don't know if I can get to 5, but I'm intrigued by Nocchain. I think they have a lot of promises, NOCK, but I think it's like an intriguing project. There have been a lot of these intriguing projects like this with alternative L1s. They have some privacy features. And it's funny talking to an OG like Tyler, he remembers some of the really old ones, and I'm going to give them as counterexamples. there are a couple of Mimble coins. It was like a new mining paradigm in 2019. Like Grin totally went to zero. And so Beam and Grin, yep. And so I bring up Nocchain because it could be one of those coins that goes in that direction, but it also has this mentality of store value and clarity around the store value, but it has some of these privacy aspects. And I'm like, that's interesting. So, yeah, I wouldn't go crazy with it, but I think it's intriguing. There's another store value experiment on Solana called Ore. It's actually like a mining contract on Solana. It's a little bit more gamified, so I don't know like long-term value, but it's interesting because of one of the Solana dApps is generating like just a lot of actual Solana income for the coin itself. So it's kind of interesting to me. And then, yeah, in the space around privacy coins and all the work there. So there's been this recent batch of sort of like Ethereum associated, you call them ICOs or TGEs, like Mega ETH and others. I'm intrigued by Aztec, and the only reason is because the devs have been building on it for a long time, and they had a really interesting version of it years ago that they shut down. And the theory that on why they shut it down is because basically, like, the government didn't like what they were doing, and they're like, yeah, we don't need to take these risks. And I had money, like a few dollars on that Aztec 3-4 years ago, and I'm not sure how much I like how they ran their TGE. I think there's good and bad parts to it, but I do think is like a novel privacy coin, a novel privacy chain. They have very solid fundamentals going into it. You know, and they don't have the track record, obviously, of a Monero or a Zcash or even a Xano, but I'm very intrigued about where Aztec goes. And I would always warn that it's easy to buy and take a lot of losses on these coins, especially in a bear market. So I'd caveat it on all these things. I'm not a huge coin investor. I don't trade in a bunch of stuff, but those are three that I find interesting. I think it'll be hard pressed to find two more that I'm like really into, because there's just a lot of garbage out there. I mean, meme coins are fun, but that's gambling. I would never recommend a meme coin to somebody. But obviously, a lot of people have made money on them, so maybe I should change my mind there.
Oh, it's fine. The choices that you make are actually quite unusual. They're not, the ones that people usually mention. And it's intriguing. I've heard a lot about Aztec lately. Even the Zcash guys talk about it, which is a good sign. It means that there is some technological merit. But we also have to remember that Ethereum is trying to integrate a lot of these features right now. I think they're trying to become a privacy chain, which is, it's not ideal, but I guess they just found the right regulatory environment to be adding privacy. And the technology is also a lot more mature nowadays, and I guess Ethereum is valuable because they can take a lot of risks, and they have a culture around destroying like the old way of doing things and trying something new, and people get excited about this. Whereas Bitcoin is very conservative, and it's conservative to the point where even the most conservative of upgrades is regarded with skepticism. But I very much look forward to seeing how Aztec and Zcash are going to improve contracts on Ethereum. They already have Railgun and Tornado Cash, which are using some of the same ZK libraries that were built by Zcash. It's interesting. For the record, for those of you who don't know, we are here around the time that ETH Denver is happening, and I haven't seen anything from the conference. I've just been out. I met Zuko yesterday. Today it was just hanging out at the hotel, meeting with you, Cameron, and doing this interview. It's really exciting. I want to ask you about privacy tech and scaling tech, because these are very important. In a way, they seem mutually exclusive. Like if you're going to add privacy, you're going to have larger transactions, which means less scalability. But I did notice with recent efforts that that's no longer the case with the compression given by zero-knowledge proofs. And is there anything around this space? You mentioned Aztec, which I think is interesting, but is there anything that fascinates you and gives you hope that we're going to have a much better future, like the cypherpunk vision that some of us were thinking about a decade ago?
Yeah. Well, and I'll say with Aztec, one of the interesting things, and I don't know much about what they're doing today, funny enough. And I harken back to what they worked on, and I know that they just keep building on that, and that they garner at least some of the respect from OGs like Zcash and Zuko. But the interesting thing is, I'll always remember that this whole narrative around Ethereum and privacy has been going around for the last few years, and basically there were two camps. One camp was you can actually add privacy onto the existing chain in different ways, and some transactions will be private and it's opt-in for the users. Like there's a capability to have privacy. And then the other camp is you need to fundamentally have privacy built into the chain from the ground up in sort of a Zcash style. Otherwise, those doing the private things will be the ones under the most scrutiny, and they'll the one that will attract specifically any criminal elements will go use those. And so Tornado Cash, unfortunately, is a perfect example of this. I used Tornado Cash in the day before the whole government stuff, and now I guess it's okay to use it again, but I haven't touched it. But it received all the scrutiny because it stood out like a sore thumb for criminals to be like, well, awesome, I'll go use this thing then. And so I do tend to fall in that bucket of where if you're just bolting on these privacy solutions for people who want to remain private in their transactions, they're going to get pulled into this whole other element, which then is going to get all of the regulatory scrutiny. And so it's very dangerous. And there's really interesting work around privacy pools in the Ethereum ecosystem is really pushed hard to be like, well, we can have these pools where we guarantee that you don't have any bad people in them, but then you have these KYC elements. And so it's like, I guess I can enter into these privacy pools, but then I sort of have to prove that I'm not a bad guy, but at least it's not broadcast to the network who I am. And so I think it's an interesting half measure, but that's why I liked the Aztec guys were very much on the side of the Zcash side of like, everything needs to be private from the get-go, and because then you won't be able to split out the bad guys from the good guys. It's just everybody's using the network. So I very much fall in that camp. And so to your point around privacy and scaling, I think those two are actually uniquely intertwined, because a lot of the way in which the ZK systems will move towards working is you can not only prove chain state and make block times much faster, because so much is happening sort of off chain, so to speak. It's almost in some of the configurations you don't need a chain in the classical sense. You can just have a known state of things that's correct and processed by the ZK algorithms, and you can bundle whatever data you want in there off chain, transactions, massive amounts of computation, like lots of cool stuff. There's intersections with AI and private compute, like that stuff is really powerful. So I'm excited by that coming. I'm not the right person to talk about that, but I think there's an intersection between scaling and privacy. The funny thing was when the L2s first launched, you had two L2s that were proposed, two kinds: optimistic rollups, optimism, and then ZK, and ZK Sync was one of the big leaders there, and Polygon eventually moved towards that, of this idea of like, yeah, everything will eventually be ZK simply because it's more efficient for us to do that rather than the way in which you store data through optimistic rollups. So long story short, I'm very intrigued by that, but I'm also really intrigued by individual apps in the crypto ecosystem that are doing things using ZK. So one of my favorite ones is called ZK P2P. They actually just launched an app called Peer, and they're really, really cool. They're in the Ethereum ecosystem, but they let you on-ramp in a privacy-preserving fashion from things like Venmo, Revolut, Zelle, and you get USDC on the other end. And they use these techniques where they're basically using zero-knowledge proofs to monitor the fact, like to check your email from Venmo that the funds came through, to then trustlessly release the funds from the escrow contract. So I think what they're doing is super cool. Their volumes are growing. I think it's one of the most unique ways to on-ramp. It's a cheaper way to on-ramp than using like a typical debit card or credit card on-ramp. And yeah, it's not perfectly private because, if you go to Onramp, you will have to send your Venmo money to some random guy. So it kind of reminds me of like the local Bitcoins days. But then that transaction is between you two. There's nothing on the network revealing that you two just had that transaction. So yeah, from a privacy standpoint, I think that's really cool. But I do think, yeah, all the stuff needs to be built now because increasingly the pressures of governments and their want to observe this stuff is going to get higher and higher. And so if the privacy tech doesn't exist in a usable form in 5 years, I wouldn't be surprised if even in the most free societies, you're effectively unable to use them because government regulatory structures are so strong. It's kind of like we have this window of time where we can do things around stablecoins and other chains and all these financial products coming from it. But yeah, at a certain point, pendulum always swings and you'll have extremely draconian measures, and the privacy chains and coins are going to be the number one target. And yeah, it's going to be kind of scary again when that happens. So I hope that we can push through, whether it's Ethereum in sort of a bolt-on way or chains like Zcash or Monero getting more adoption, or Aztec.
You have been in Bitcoin for about 16 years now, and I want to ask you, where do you see both Bitcoin and the whole crypto industry in another 16 years? Given the progress that you've seen and the information that you have about ongoing stuff, where do you think we're going to be in another 16 years?
I think, although I'm a store value maximalist today, I think in 16 years with Bitcoin, you will have very real ways to spend sats in different places for everyday transactions. I think we will realize that future. Obviously Square is pushing forward with that at payment terminals, and I think that's massive to have a company of that scale doing that. I just personally don't think it makes sense for a lot of people to do today, but in 16 years, yep, I think in certain jurisdictions that will make a ton of sense. I think that we will see increasing financialization around Bitcoin, and we didn't really talk about DATs and that whole thing, but it's going to be good and bad. You're going to continue to have people create paper Bitcoin and derivative Bitcoin, and so you need to be very cognizant of how you hold it and how you give it to people. And that's why I come back to gifting non-custodial Bitcoin is really critical, because you don't want to gift someone paper Bitcoin and then be like, oh, sorry, you didn't claim it in time, or that company went under, or something like that. And now you're going to have further rehypothecation through all these products. And so it'll be good and bad. I think it means that, people care about the price of Bitcoin relative to the dollar. If they don't, great. But if they do, you'll also get crazy volatility swings as entire markets are able to come in through synthetic and optioned products at an even bigger scale than we saw this cycle. But the ability to spend Bitcoin, and I think we'll likely see more side on the sovereign side. Obviously, everybody watches the whole situation in El Salvador and other countries, but I think we will get these revelations of very large sovereign wealth funds that are taking very real positions in Bitcoin. I think in the last couple of months, people have been bearish because it's like, well, is everybody just going to buy gold? But I think realistically, you're going to have two sets of governments. You're going to have the governments who already had enough gold to make it worthwhile to increase their stockpiles. And you'll have the governments who have effectively no gold because they came up in sort of a post-World War II, like they grew their economies in a post-World War II scenario, and everyone's like, post-Bretton Woods, you don't need gold. And they bought that, and now they're sitting on top of a bunch of bonds from other governments that might go down. So I do think those governments will likely much more readily start to hold Bitcoin, likely through a similar way as the US, through seizures, that they seize it or they tax people in it. So I think that'll happen in this sort of 16-year timeline. On the Ethereum side, I think things are a lot less certain. And the reason I say that is, the institutional adoption of it has been phenomenal, but they're adopting the tech, not the coin. And a lot of people have talked about this extensively. I do think that the neutrality of Ethereum is really, really critical for it to actually be used for a lot of these financial products, whether it's real world assets or other like tokenization of stocks on chain. That'll happen likely on Ethereum because it's more neutral than the JP Morgan chain, and Wells Fargo won't want to use that kind of thing. So I think that's likely. But you see something like Tempo emerging, and Tempo is going to be likely a pretty critical payments chain. And Ethereum will have to compete with that. And so I think Stripe is at the forefront of this, but you very well could start to see other large institutional money managers and asset managers say, well, we could go build our own asset chain now and just use all the best of the Ethereum tech. So I do think that Ethereum's push towards privacy is critical, and these big institutions and companies like Stripe are very conservative and risk averse, and they're not going to build that. So I think that's a big piece of the future of it. And then I do, I think if you asked me a year ago about like AI payments and stuff, I would have laughed at it. There are a bunch of AI meme coins and other coins that came out that kind of didn't really do anything, but now I can see that future. I think there's still a lot of fluff and a lot of people just building stuff for the sake of it, but I do think Ethereum has a leg up on X402 payments for resolving not just agentic commerce, but realistically what it's going to be is I'm going to tell my agent as a human that I want to buy the best digital camera out there, and the agent will then go pay through X402. So I think that is coming, and that could be sort of like the saving grace for Ethereum as an ecosystem, as a chain, that agentic commerce, this reorientation from me going to Google and finding the thing and me talking to Claude or ChatGPT to find the thing, and then I'll spend through there, could radically change it necessarily versus say stablecoin retail payments, where I do think something like a Tempo might lead ahead. And all along the way, I mean, I think Solana is a very competitive chain. They're going to do interesting stuff. They'll be neck and neck with all of these things. But I do think that Ethereum has, from a neutrality perspective among these big institutions, won a critical mass. You see lots of large asset issuances actually happening there. All the stuff in 2017 that was promised is sort of starting to happen today, which is pretty cool to see. But yeah, I think it's two very different paths. I think that Ethereum and Bitcoin look very different today, and they're just going to look even more different in the next 10 years.
Something that I respect about your answer is that there's no price prediction in it. Like, you did not say, oh, I think Bitcoin will be at $10 million and we're going to be everywhere and we're going to be living in large mansions and whatever. Like, there's no focus on the speculation, it's just technology, which is something that I deeply respect. For the people listening to this and getting up until the end of the episode, would you mind coming up with a word that they can write in the comments, like just to brag that they were able, or they had the patience to listen to the interview until the end? And also, maybe I'm pushing it with this proposal right now, but would it be possible for the listeners of the podcast to get a special discount for ordering burners, like a promo code or whatever?
Totally. Vlad, I'll let you name the promo code, and then I'll set it up after we listen here, and we'll do a 25% off promo code. And the cool thing about that is, you can buy a single Bitcoin pack, but we also sell them in 6-packs, and that's already a discount, so it'll be 25% off of that. So you'll be able to get a nice 6-pack of cards if you want to gift them. Yeah, in the 6-pack, and maybe more than that. Let me think. Yeah, one and change. Let me think of a good word to leave us with here at the conclusion. That will be the one that we listen through. I'm trying to think of something that's topical to all of our discussion. I
mean, I sort of put you on the spot. I didn't give you time to think about it.
No, that's fine. I'm trying to think through some of the more interesting things I've read or on the topic, and I think one of my favorite books. So I'm going to give us a book title for people to put in the comments. Is the Devil Take the Hindmost, and that's spelled HINDMOST. Devil Take the Hindmost. So if you get the word hindmost, that's good, because that's a weird classical word, and it's a book about boom and bust cycles, the history of boom and bust cycles. Nothing to do with crypto. Really fascinating. Highly recommend reading it. You know, one of the topics it talks about is like how railroads were built in the UK through the middle of the 19th century. So like the railroads came and you had all these people raising all this money to build railroads, and they overbuilt. They actually have way less railroad infrastructure today in England than they did back then. And so I'd highly recommend reading the book. It talks about these different boom bust cycles, and especially as people think about crypto, because I think crypto has fundamental value. Bitcoin, all these tools, Ethereum, but there's always a boom bust cycle. So if you're feeling kind of bearish and down about the market right now, pick up a copy of The Devil Take the Hindmost, and maybe it'll make you feel a little bit better.
Yeah, and the promo code for 25% off will be BTCTKVR, which is like an abbreviation without vowels of Bitcoin Takeover. Thank you very much for the special offer. Thank you for the special word, and thank you for your time. And for everyone listening, I hope that you learned something new here. I'll see you in the next one.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Vlad.